one was the 2019.
Very interesting.
A lot of usage, yeah.
Okay.
We're all shut in, you know.
Mr. Platt,
Yes.
do you remember last week when I asked you, we were talking about the people, and I had asked you if there was anywhere in the Bible that it said that?
I don't remember that conversation, but that doesn't prove anything.
It did mean off, they were saying that the giants were eating people, but that's not in those Bibles. So I don't know. But
Right offhand, I don't remember any specific reference to that.
African tribes and stuff.
And my theological response would be that given the Bible's perspective clearly reflected in the creation and Noah story, that issue was never a concern. There was the creation story and Noah make it pretty pointed that there is a significant gulf between humans and animals.
Yeah.
And so while the eating of animals is permitted, it would never have occurred to them that humans, and there are the couple of references of the horror of destruction involving the eating of children.
Yeah. I think, I'm not sure, but I think Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, they were pretty much contemporary.
No, Isaiah is 100 years before Ezekiel and Jeremiah.
And which one came after Jeremiah, after Isaiah did?
Isaiah is in the 700s when Assyria carries the northern tribes captive. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are in the 500s when Babylon carries Judah away.
Yeah.
So you have virtually 2 generations.
I thought I had read that somewhere, and I've been looking for it.
Yeah.
I've not been able to find it, because sometimes you go to the concordance and you really can't find what you're looking for.
No, for a topic like that, you would need what's called a topical index, where they're sorting scriptures by topic, by idea, not by the particular word that's used. And there's several of those available. Nave's Topical Bible is the old traditional one, and it's available on the internet. But if you Google the question, you probably would get even a better, quicker response than you would trying to look in the topical index.
I'm not really a computer person or
Yeah.
a Google person.
Yeah, I know. That's why I still encourage things like the topical Bibles. And we have a couple of those here in the library.
I like the book.
So if you wanted to access those, they're here.
There's a library here?
Yeah, I've got a whole big room in there.
Oh, where's it at? Over here?
No, it's up there in that front part.
Oh, I haven't seen it. I didn't know that.
It's still in disarray from the move and the flood.
Right.
But most of those basic reference items I have sorted where they're readily available.
You didn't do that. I'll be glad to come help you.
Well, it's basically in sorting it, you have to have some idea about what the purpose of the book is. And unfortunately, what happened was we decided, it was always in this back room, and we decided to switch it to this, which it was a big room, but it had been divided into two smaller rooms. So we took the wall out and put the chapel in there, and I kept my library. I had mine back here in this back room because it was big enough to have a full table in there. We could use it for a classroom, and I could have my stuff in it too, and we didn't lose any classroom space. And then when we needed the chapel, more chapel room, we decided to switch them. Well, the day that we were switching them, I got started and something happened at SEAM and I had to go to SEAM. So when I come back, they've moved everything and not, had no idea what order the books were in and paying any attention. They could have, moved them shelf by shelf and just put them in a shelf, and it wouldn't have been any major problem, but that was a little more thought than they were willing to give to it. And so they just pulled the books out of the bookshelves, moved the bookshelves, and put the books back in. And
the same thing with the dictionary, like the way you did with that topic.
Yeah, you have the ideas, the topics,
Yeah.
and then you just have a list of scriptures that the writer of that book thinks applies to that topic.
Because sometimes I look for a word and I can't find it.
Yeah, no, right. Yeah, and see, now you have the problem that unless you are an absolute exclusivist in terms of the Bible translation you use, you're going to have heard a scripture no telling in any one of half a dozen different translations. And you're going to remember that by that wording. Well, you have to have a concordance for that translation in order to find that verse. And that will throw you off. And that's why it has become just more and more useful to learn a basic Bible program on a computer, because then you can do those searches much more quickly and do multiple translations. So you Google, you search for this phrase in one translation, it doesn't show up, you change the translation and it will immediately run it. I've got a much more sophisticated program that if I tell it to do this search for this, it will do the search through all the translations that I have up.
Wow.
And so I will get a list of all the verses of any of those translations that use that word, and then what word is used in all the other translations. So I get every translation, every verse that a translation uses that word, it will give me that same verse in all the translations I have. So I can see all the verses that any one of them translate that word that way in that verse.
Yeah.
So I can do a real comparison. Okay.
This, it will come up on your phone, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, what was I going to do first? Whiteboard. Well, I don't want to take the time to update. There we go. not getting the sound that I got earlier on here.
Yeah, it's hard to hear. I'm hard of hearing anyway.
Can't see you. I can hear more. You're right up in the front.
I am reminded of the universal debate. The honor of friendship cannot impose on this time. The wealth of the world cannot seize our interests. Nor will the innocence of youth the charms of beauty propitiate its purpose. This scene reminds us of our own mortality. Sooner or later, these frail bodies must return to the parent dust. The evergreen, which once marked the temporary resting place of the illustrious dead, is an emblem of our faith in the immortality of the soul. By this we are reminded that we have an immortal part within us, which will survive, which can never die. By this we are admonished that, though like our brother Daer remains like the forest, we too shall be clothed in the elements of death and deposited in the side of the tomb. Yet through our belief in the mercy of God, we may confidently hope that our souls will bloom. We hope this too, confidently. Alas, my brother, we cherish his spirit. We commend his spirit unto God who gave, and we consign his body to grief. The great Creator, having been pleased out of his infinite mercy to remove our brother from the cares and toils of this transitory existence to a state of endless duration, thus severing the eternal link that binds us together. May we who survive be more strongly cemented in the ties of union and friendship, and in a short space allotted us, wisely and usefully employ our time, and in the reciprocal intercourse of kind and friendly acts, mutually promote the welfare and happiness of each other. And we pray, we consign the body of our deceased Daer, earth to earth, and ashes to ashes. That's there to remain until the trump shall sound in the resurrection morning. We can confidently leave him in the hands of the King that doeth all things. Let us pray. Most holy and glorious Lord God, author of all good and giver of all mercy, pour down thy blessings upon us and strengthen our solemn engagements with the ties of sons. May the present instance of mortality remind us of our own approach, and by drawing our attention toward thee, our only refuge in time of need, induce us so to regulate our conduct here, that when the final moment shall arise, at which we must flip this transitory scene, the blinding prospect of thy mercy may dispel the fear of death. And after our departure hence, in peace and thy favor, be received into thy everlasting kingdom. And there join in fellowship with our freedom. May enjoy the uninterrupted and unceasing fellowship, allowing the souls of justice. They pray. In the name of the Son of righteousness, we pray. Amen.
The last secrecy is
There, around you, and a peace the world cannot give nor take away, sleeps the unhindered day. The gentle breeze fans their burden covering, the day is gone. The sunshine and the storms pass away, and they are not disturbed. Stones and pleasure monuments symbolize the affection of the surviving friends, yet no sound proceeds from them, save that silent but thrilling admonition. Seek ye the narrow path and straight gate that leads into eternal life. The lambskin, or white apron, is an emblem of innocence and the badge of amazement, and it is a mark of distinction of worldly worn. The symbol I now deposit with the casket of the deceased brother Daer. By it, we are reminded of the universal dominion of death. The armor of friendship cannot impose to prevent its coming. The wealth of the world cannot cease our use, nor will the innocence of youth and the charms of beauty propitiate its purpose. This scene reminds us of our own mortality. Sooner or later, these frail bodies must return to their parent dust. The evergreen, which once marked its.
Okay. One of the few places you get as an outsider an introduction to Freemasonry. How many of these services have you been a witness to? Any?
Zero.
You've never been to, you've never been to one like that? Okay, that's interesting.
They did some stuff, but it wasn't close to what everybody did,
Yeah, it's an open funeral. This is a service, a memorial service they do at every service that they aren't excluded from of a Mason.
Now, I've been to one, and they had a minister, but they also.
Yes, which is their traditional, far more common thing in this country, especially, where the vast majority of funerals are presided over by a cleric of one church or another. And so then when the Masons do this part of the service, they have to coordinate it with the funeral home, the clergyman who's involved. This one was actually done inside the church building, which is not uncommon. All the ones that I've had have all been graveside services. Well, I take that back. Way back in the beginning, I may have had one where they did it in the church.
This is actually in the funeral home.
Yes, and of course, they're not near the funerals in church buildings aren't near as common as they were when I started 50 years ago. I can't think of the last time I went to a funeral service in a church building.
I have, like recently, it's more memorial, where you don't have to.
Oh yeah, they right.
Have everybody.
Yeah, you have some kind of a life celebration, they frequently call it now, so they don't have to worry about pay for the funeral of home people and the expense that's involved in that. But most of the services that I've conducted where the Masons wanted to have this service, it was done at the graveside.
Okay. I guess it depends on the place.
Yes, and in one of the instruction books that I read of their memorial services, there is a very, very pointed explanation to the reader who's a Mason who's going to conduct this service about how there are some denominations in this country who don't appreciate that at all, and they will refuse to allow you to be a part of the service. And there are others then that are going to control when and under what circumstances, and you just have to be aware of that. And then there's a nice power struggle as to who's going to get to do it at the graveside, for instance, because it's not uncommon to have a funeral service even in a church, and the graveside service is conducted quite independently of the church service. And so the pastor may not even be at the graveside service. The Veterans Cemetery here in Houston, it's almost impossible to coordinate a graveside service, which isn't at the graveside anymore. You only can do it as at a little chapel, open chapel at various places in the cemetery, and then the casket, even if it's there, is removed, and when it gets to the graveside and gets buried depends entirely on their schedule. So you're only having a service on the grounds for the family, so that a family who was really insistent on having a Masonic service at the graveside could negotiate with the cemetery and the funeral home, you see, and cut a pastor out and say, you know, the Masons are having the service here.
That's because of the virus, or has that been going on for a long time?
In terms of,
Out at the cemetery.
it's a long time. It's strictly a matter of numbers. And there are other cemeteries that are starting to do this. I had one several years ago in Kentucky, where even when you came from the funeral home in the procession and you drove into the cemetery, they drove you to a little open chapel, and they took the casket out, and you had the graveside service there, and where in the cemetery the grave was, you didn't even see. You couldn't even go there.
Well, that, you know, I don't know about that. Now, maybe because of the virus, but I've been to some here in Texas, and they actually go directly.
Oh yeah, most of them do, but this is, that's strictly under the control of the cemetery. And this cemetery had already started the practice of, that way, see, they don't have to put up a tent and walkways and all that kind of stuff. They don't have to worry about people stepping in a hole and twisting an ankle and all those kinds of things. So their liability is greatly reduced if they don't have people wandering around in the cemetery. The first funeral I ever had, we not only had the cemetery, the interment in the cemetery, because this gentleman lived in this little town several miles from the bigger city, from the bigger town where the funeral home was. There were people who had walked from the little village out to the cemetery who hadn't been at the funeral service. So we opened the casket again and had a second viewing and that is almost unheard of, but you know, the funeral home family was willing to accommodate these folk in this little town, and so they did it. Funeral homes are getting to where now more and more you're seeing them not having a procession. You have the service at the church or at the funeral home. You tell the people, we're going to have the graveside service, such and such a cemetery at such and such a time. There are maps if you don't know how to find your way there. We'll see you there if you want to come. Because the processions through traffic are just becoming such a nightmare. And so they don't even try to do it. But that's another change. Anyway, the point of this.
It's usually like here, they usually have like a funeral home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand.
Except that was new.
A long time. No, that went back to 50 years that we would have the cemetery and.
But it was new. I was here in Houston in '60 when Lawndale built the funeral home on the cemetery property. Second in the country.
Which one? Where?
At Lawndale.
Lawndale?
Yeah, that chapel there was the second chapel built in a cemetery in the country. California beat us by a couple of years. But sure. Yeah, then it's all in one location. Yeah, it was in the 60s. Yeah, early 60s. It may have been built in the very late, no, I'm pretty sure I came here in 62 and I went to their introduction of the chapel. They had a big deal to let the clergy know how they were going to operate. And so they invited us up there to look over the situation. And among other things, they have they don't do it anymore, but the front of the main chapel, all the panels were just like 6 feet wide, 5 feet wide, and they were all on swivels. So all the flowers that they put on the panel The whole end of this, they could put them on the outside, right off the truck, swivel the things around, and they'd be inside. They could put the ones on the outside for the next service, and as soon as the family got out and with the deceased and the casket, they could swing the panels around, and they'd have the flowers already up for the next service, and they could let people start coming in for the next service.
Are you saying that they have the cemetery first? And then
Oh yeah, they had the cemetery for years.
And then put the,
They built the chapel in the cemetery, yeah. Nowadays, of course, new ones will frequently spring up, and it's all,
something now that they're doing, which I found out from Gloria, because my dad and sisters were coming, I've got a plot there as well. Anyway, all I'm saying, that was back like in the 50s. And that's the reason I was wondering about that, because they died as babies.
yeah.
But, what was I, now they're doing what they did at the vet, over with the vets, they buried on top of each other.
Oh yeah.
See, they never did that before either,
No.
until probably about 10 years ago.
It's been done.
But I'm talking about Forest.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Forest Park is always was #1 because we had people like Jesse Jones.
Yeah.
The Cullens and all
Oh, yeah.
that. Now, since that time, of course, they've gone out to work.
It was the premier cemetery.
Yeah, and now,
And guess what was across the street? Does anybody know what was across the street from Forest Lawn?
well, I know my niece went to school with the girl over there that they always sold the markers.
Yeah, the marker industry is still right there. And one of the premier marker groups, the Schlitzbergers, are across the street.
The flower shop?
Across the street, just on the other side of the bayou. They're on the south side of the bayou. On the east side of Lawndale, on the north side of the bayou is the golf course, which was the first country club in Houston. So you had the prestigious country club and the prestigious cemetery
But
right across the river.
right there around the cemetery was the Via de Montana, which was a very high class, very high class subdivision.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
That was-
That's like, right close to that, is that, I guess, I don't know if they're Dominicans or not, but that's that.
Yes, yes.
What I understand, what's so interesting to me is my mother, I don't know if she was or not, but she told me that when you go in there as a convent, as a girl, as a nun, you don't speak to anybody ever. You don't talk to your relatives, you don't write letters, and supposedly, once you get in there, you may talk, but it's like only for maybe 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there. But no, you take a vow of silence.
Yeah.
So what you're supposed to do is pray. And so every time I drive by there, it's a beautiful building, the convent and everything. And I thought, wow, well, you could do that. I know I could.
I heard there were no men allowed there.
No, because it's a convent.
Yeah. Okay, back to the Masons.
That could be funny, they're not supposed to.
Uh,
Not even to do the art, not even to do the art, or the summer or something.
Oh, I guess,
Under special circumstances, they might let you in.
they're not gonna have.
Uh,
I used to jump the fence over there when I was a little kid. I used to jump the fence and come through there. It would always come out and chase them. Call the police on them. We didn't even know it was a convent. We didn't
Yeah.
know it was a convent.
and, right.
Well, it's the truth, I'm not gonna hide it.
Would you, having seen this first time, what would be your impression of the Masons with respect to religion?
They're supposed to be Christian, But they're not supposed to really talk about their religion because they're different denominations.
Yeah, but-
They're supposed to be Christian.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
No, no.
What I read.
No. There are a couple of orders
And I know they're not Catholic.
in the Masonic tradition who are Christian oriented, explicitly Christian.
Okay.
But Masonry more widely only requires you to be a believer in God.
Oh.
The great architect of creation.
But why so much secrecy in it?
Well, that's just one of the things they did. This is 15th, well, I guess 16th century is when it begins to emerge. Fundamentally, as they present themselves, a fraternal order. A major concern being a support of each other, especially upon your death and the care of your family. And there are a couple of other organizations that have that same great focus. It's generally considered that it grew out of the guilds of the Middle Ages. And as they begin to decline, some of them begin to decline as industrialization reduces their importance and value. Brickmaking becomes a far more economical job being done by big factories. And so stonemasonry becomes less of demand, becomes more expensive comparatively. And so the stonemasons are losing their viability. Some attribute it to the, blame it on the Protestant Reformation, which greatly reduces the strength of the church to build cathedrals. And so now stonemasons are losing their jobs. And so its title, Freemasonry, arises out of this myth, however true it may be, that its early origins are related to this Masonry guild, and so they call themselves Masons because that's what they were. It quickly reaches beyond that, but some of its early symbolism, of course, grows out of that background, and for lack of a better comparison, you have a boys' club for grown men, kind of a thing. And the secrecy could be something that is, quote, necessary or essential. My suspicion is, from a social standpoint, it was simply a way of enhancing the mystique of the order. As long as it's a big secret, you know, there's something even more special about it. And for those of us who are starting this and therefore are the initial leaders, there's a great deal more control we have if this is a secret thing. Because now we have even more influence over who can do what, who we can put out, because we've got a whole new set of rules, you see, an additional set of rules of secrecy. So there's, from what little I've been able to read about it, there's not anything about it that has to be secrets. I mean, it's not like they're doing things nefariously and surreptitiously and controllingly and this kind of stuff in terms of the Masonic order itself.
They say you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics.
Well,
So that's what they're saying. And I guess that's a good thing, because if people thought that they were behind the scenes, you know.
and that, of course, is exactly what they're charged with, particularly politically.
Right.
As you have very prominent people in the Western world and the United States, it became a much bigger thing in the United States than anywhere else in the world until the 20th century.
It was just another different type of Catholic they were, huh? Because a lot of them were like KKK. Or
Yeah, it was another club to belong to. And
Well, I read, and I think it was more like it's a racist thing to me.
well, it had those.
And but the blacks had their own, you know.
And so did the
They had their own.
Yes.
But even today, they still do, and I don't think they get into the white, the whites have to the black.
The,
Still very much.
so why is that? Why?
but initially it was it was a local thing. It was the guys all knew each other. But once you get started with this cohesive membership and this secrecy, then it increasingly becomes an exclusive club. And you obviously can't join except by invitation. You have to have a current member who's willing to front you as a prospective member. And they develop very elaborate procedures, techniques, ceremonies to emphasize this uniqueness, this particularness. And so they can control their membership in a pretty significant way.
It's supposed to be secret.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be allowed, but you have snitches.
Oh, yeah, right.
But see, this is just like if you went to college and you're.
And it's fraternity, sorority.
I got handshakes and I can't tell you.
Right, yeah.
So it's,
Yeah.
it's a bunch of kids, like, and maybe they went to college and they liked it, so they're gonna stay in the fraternity.
And so you have that aspect of it. And it becomes an issue for the church, particularly the Catholic Church originally. Yeah, so the question is, why would the Catholics not like them? Why would the Catholics be opposed to them? Of course. So why would Catholicism immediately react negatively to a fraternal order of men who want to mutually support each other? Long before the elaborate charity became a big thing for some of them, why would there be any opposition to it?
So you have some of them that have been in there for more than 30 years, and then they leave.
Yes.
They spill beans.
Yes.
They squeal.
Yeah, you got several websites of them
They
now.
tell the whole thing.
So why would the Catholic Church be so opposed?
I would say because of money. That's what I would say.
Because of what?
Money.
That's one element.
The
But
Catholic Church is just as secretive, and I guess they just don't like anybody like you said, you know, they want them to be Catholic.
yeah, but what's the fundamental characteristic in the final analysis, especially of the medieval Catholic Church?
Because they stole money.
Yeah, but how they do that?
The rich.
How they do that?
Oh, they gave it to the rich and not the church, that's it.
It's like Robin Hood. I don't know where I got this information.
I don't either, but it's.
No, but what was the fundamental characteristic socially, to some degree religiously, of the medieval church in Europe, the Catholic Church, is it?
Well, you had to pay them all the time for everything.
Yes, but how do they get away with that?
Well, they scared you because you think you've got to have.
How can they get away with that?
Hanging out for
Because they had the authority. They controlled by authority. Often that was simply granted. They obviously claimed it and asserted it. And when they could, they enforced it militarily, physically, violently. They had authority. The fundamental characteristic of, it was the hierarchy of the church
Oh, it was.
was an authoritative structure. And they controlled everything they possibly could.
Including the days of the week.
Yeah.
Well, including, like, you remember Henry VIII had all those wives, and we finally said, we're not going to be Catholic anymore. So
The control, you see, of who could declare himself, who could control himself king.
And he said,
And so Charlemagne gets himself crowned by the Pope. Why in the world? He had an army. He conquered everybody around him. Why did he need the Pope to say he could be the king? Well, he didn't really. But that's the aura of authority that it possessed. And now here's this little secret society to which you are, by your membership, yielding authority.
I don't see that. How much authority do they have?
That depends on how much authority they're able to
They're just a
offer.
little town and stuff. I don't know.
But no, now, but we're talking about 1500s when they start.
And they were Masons?
Yes,
They didn't have that much authority, I don't think.
to the group they did. If you came in, your allegiance
You got like, what, 20 men, and you got
and
thousands of Catholics?
their allegiance is to each other and to their leaders,
That would
and
be easy to knock off. The
Well,
Catholics wouldn't be worried about that, I don't think.
not in terms of its ability, but in terms of letting these grow in their membership, of their people becoming members of a group where now they have an alternative authority. Just the idea. Now take the reverse that we had in this country. How could you have a president of the United States who by his faith was committed to the authority of the Pope in Rome?
What president is that?
Any president. That's why we didn't have any Catholic presidents. Because we Protestants, and a whole lot of Catholics, couldn't conceive of a secular authority who, at least theoretically, as a good Catholic, is submissive to the Pope in Rome. And so you get attacked by somebody, and the Pope tells the leader of the country, you really shouldn't retaliate. That wouldn't be the right thing to do.
Well, you have a different vision, or maybe I'm all wrong about the Catholic Church. Because I would assume that they would want a president, and they would be happy like him.
Sure, they would like to have a president so they could,
They more rule and
so he would appoint, so he would never let Roe versus Wade become a law. We got, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the great point. And see, that's why you have the struggle even now.
I think aren't they, like membership, isn't the Catholic Church going down quite a bit? But it's because of what they're doing, not what their members are doing. It's what they're doing. And I'm talking about the priests and.
Yes, and you're back to, you see, this very struggle of authority. The church had, in the Middle Ages, tremendous authority.
Yeah, but it's dwindled.
Of course, they have lost authority because of guilds, secret societies.
No, because of their actions.
No. It wouldn't have made any difference if you didn't have people who could say to the Pope, we don't care what you think. The authority, in practical terms, is eroded because they took positions, made edicts, tried to enforce rules and regulations that people in with a growing democratic spirit were not willing to accept. But in the Middle Ages, you didn't have people like that. There weren't any little d Democrats around.
Well, during this time, though, there were other organizations too, and groups such as the Freemasons.
There were a few, but not many. There weren't many alternative social groups that existed. And in terms of organized groups, there weren't hardly any. When this organization comes into existence. Now, once it's there as a model, then you get several fraternal orders. Oddfellows is one, was fairly common in this country for years. Woodmans of America or something like that is another one that has gotten formed. And the ethnic groups in this country frequently formed ones. They may have brought them over, they may have created them here, because you didn't have any social, economic security.
Yeah.
If you got hurt on the job and you couldn't work, how did your family survive? So neighborhoods, ethnic groups, Masons, Oddfellows formed these fraternal groups to look out for each other, to take care of each other. Several of the unions that were first started in this country, they still have the name Brotherhood of. They were fraternal orders for people in that job capacity to take care of each other when they got hurt, when they had a need. They became
How they started?
Yes, they started as a fraternal order.
Was that during medieval time?
Yeah, you were talking about 1500s.
The Masons have been.
Yeah. And there's a lodge in London, one in Ireland, one in Scotland, that was one of the very first ones formed, and they're still in existence. And they have archives of 400 years of records. And they were community self-support groups. To what degree they begin to develop the kind of elaborate ceremony, tradition, procedures, dependent on the group. The Masons go all out. And so the Masonic Lodge is set up in a very specific way, stations around the room. It became a very, very sacred place. They even use words like that. The central document to which they swear allegiance is the sacred book. It may or may not be the Bible. I'm not sure what the alternatives they developed for that if it wasn't the Bible.
They have the Mason Bible, don't
Well, that's just the Bible with lots of Masonic stuff in it.
Right.
And none of the secret stuff is in it.
Of course not.
But there's no secrets.
But and it was just a big, it was a big Bible to put on the coffee table to record the traditions of the family and for you to be able to look at it and that kind of thing. Lots of artwork, pictures put in it. So it was a very, very elaborate Bible. But there was nothing, quote, Masonic about the Bible itself part in it. They don't use the Bible in any direct, specific way, with the exception of, since these are all independent lodges, then the particular flavor of every lodge is greatly affected by the men who belong to it and how aggressively they want to push this, that, or the other. In some places in this country, by the time you get to the Civil War and beyond, Masonry has become a pretty active, pretty popular thing in this country. And so there are communities in the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, where a Masonic lodge was one of the first public buildings built. The school, a church, but very quickly the Masons in town, in the community, would put together and they would build themselves a lodge. Because that space was so laid out, so particular, so specific, and all kinds of mythologies built into it. Through all these years, they have always insisted that they weren't a religion. In the last 100 years, especially in the last 50 years, you've gotten an increasing backlash among the Protestants, various groups, various people within them, who argue that that ain't so. Their chief argument for it, against it, is things like this. The service we just saw. What's the oldest signs of religion to the anthropologist?
Here or
in the world? Oldest signs of religion among human beings in the world.
They have a lot of similar, like the cross and the fish and all that.
I mean, even way back further than that. How do anthropologists point at religion in the human species in the earliest stage? How people are buried. It's the only remains they have. You know, they don't have any photographs of those early years to say, oh, you know, here's their church buildings and whatever. It's how they were buried, what they put with them when they were buried. Now, it may not have been religious at all, but we interpret it that way at least. How we deal with death is understood by the sociologist, by the anthropologist. That's encompassed within our rubric, our category of religion. Long before we have...
If they don't believe in a God.
Or an afterlife.
An afterlife.
Yeah. Then we don't have anything except bones and, you know, no trinkets, etc., 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 no figurines, you know. So the real question is this a figurine? Is this a little girl's doll? Well, you know, but very early, anthropology, archaeologists look at burial to see what kind of religious elements they can interpret.
Like though say for instance in Egypt though, the rich person was buried like that, but the poor person wasn't.
Well, but to what degree even the poor person, even though they got almost thrown into a mass grave, is there anything there that indicates their understanding, their feelings, their ideas about immortality, life after death,
They would have some of
the gods? See? So my point is,
Like some Indians though, they would
yeah,
put them up on a
right,
stake.
you know, how they treat them, right, how they understand that. See, now my point is, since socially, anthropologically, archaeologically, we've had this strong attachment of religion and how we deal with death. One of the few public ceremonies that you can publicly see of Masonry is the funeral, a memorial service in which he very explicitly talks about our mortality, our immortality, and our morality. This person died, this brother has left, and we're having this service to remind us that we face death, so we ought to get ready. He said that in so many words.
Well, that's usually what they say, you know.
Of course.
Anybody, not just Mason.
I know, but that's religion. That's morality. So here's a service that partakes of all these essential elements of religion. And it's a service of Freemasonry. Can you say it's not a religion?
I don't think so.
If you see, it presents itself as concerned with your morality to face death.
So does that mean the person who died has to be religious?
Well, that may, and that's part of the question.
That was my question, because
Yes.
maybe he is a Freemason, but he wasn't.
He never went to church. He never belonged to any religious organization. Yes, that's okay with them. And so the question is,
But it doesn't matter to him.
right, and so the question is, did his Masonry become his religion?
Yeah.
Did it function for him, providing all the spirituality, all the consciousness of God, all of the concern of his morality, and his ability to face God with a clean conscience because he'd been a good man? Did Masonry function for him in that way?
Yeah, but we have to go back and see what other things that they did as Masons, because he didn't know anything about this funeral and what they're talking about. You see what I'm saying?
No, he would have.
He would know the Christians, and he would have to know all the things, like different things that they were doing, which was being good and charitable and stuff.
Yeah, but he had to know all that because he couldn't become a Mason without knowing that well enough to talk about it in the tests that he was given as he moved up in the ranks.
Well, I think some of them know probably like Christians, the ones that are and the ones that weren't. They were good people. They did.
No, this isn't a Christian service. This is the Mason service.
Yeah, but they probably don't have that for everybody.
Oh yeah, for every Mason, every loyal Mason whose family wants this service gets it.
Family that wants the service, that's the key. A lot of the families say, no, we have a minister.
No, but if he's religious, but if he wasn't involved in church, Masonry was his.
We were involved in church because my neighbor who I saw this, he was a Methodist. And it's a strange thing to me. I started thinking about all the Methodists I know that are Masons.
Yes, yes, yes. A lot of Christians, a lot of active church members in America are Masons, have been for several generations.
Like a lot of police,
Like what?
a lot of policemen.
Yes. And I never had thought about that as to what degree of them are involved in that, and if so, why? Masonry is not near as prolific as it was 50 years ago. There are a lot of Masonic halls, the lodges, that are closing because their old members are dying off and their sons and their grandsons aren't becoming Masons. They're not interested in this fraternal connection. It holds no attraction to them.
And a lot of times I think, I know my grandfather, he was one of the top Masons, but a lot of them had money. And like if it's not going to the small towns and stuff, it was like the leaders of the community.
Yes.
It's sort of like a church. If you're a doctor, you're going to go to church because you're going to meet your patients there. You know, if you're a lawyer, you're going to go to church because you want to meet your people. And so it all ties back to business a lot of times too. You get out there.
Yeah, this becomes the in crowd.
Yeah. And I'll help you if you help me.
And could be wielded in the community in both positive and negative ways, depending upon the character and the interests and concerns of the men who are involved in it.
But your character should be very.
But it presents itself, and in many cases was aggressive about this good character, which it was interpreted in this fraternal sequence or factor, so that your character involved not just your basic morality, and in a Christian country like America, that was fundamentally Christian morals. And so they weren't going to tolerate any of the list of sins that we had. But it included charity. Since it was founded as a fraternal order, that became a big thing. And so you had several of these orders that developed in highly committed fraternal or benevolent programs. The Shriners, of course, being the ultimate example. Aggressively developing hospitals and so forth.
I got to know two of them they were teachers. And they would give a lot of time to teaching, and you had to earn so much teaching before they would give you a Mason Bible, and they would bring the Mason Bibles to work and.
And so now you see easily another factor that would trouble the church. Because here's all this benevolent activity being done at great expense to these members, separate from the church.
Yeah, their money was going over there.
Their money was not.
Another thing too, like if you go to Shriners Hospital, that's free.
Yeah.
If your child's burnt and everything, you go there free. You go to a Catholic hospital, it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that cutting into
this clearly, you see, there was this real drive for care of others.
There's one policeman, he was a Shriner for
Yeah. I've had 2 or 3 men in the past in churches that I've been in who were far more active in the Masonry than they were in the church.
We knew his family and everything, and he told us that, we knew his wife and her family, and the wife was very pretty. And, you know, he said the same thing that she said, that they really didn't even love each other. That she was more like a trophy wife to him. That where he would go to
Yeah.
the shrine, that's what he was saying.
Yeah, yeah,
That, and she would say the same thing too.
yeah.
That he just had her just for a trophy wife. She was very pretty. The lady was very pretty. She was very pretty. She was not just pretty, she was very pretty.
Well, yeah, I don't think that she was pretty inside, was she a nice person?
No, I'm not talking about beautiful, that guy. I'm talking about on the outside, the looks, her hair.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. If you look
Yeah.
pretty,
The trophy.
inside and out.
Right. To me, I think it's more on the inside than the outside. To me.
Yeah, but,
That's the beauty of it.
but some poor ladies get cursed with beauty on the outside.
I know. That's actually better, trust me. They live you about 20.
But he would say that he was a policeman. He would say
Yeah.
And he was a very nice trapper.
Now, since
Oh, he loved Jerry Lee Station.
Since the Masons require this belief in God, the great architect of the universe, officially, they declare themselves non-religious because they never go further in trying to define him. So theoretically, as in AA, you can believe in the higher power and define him or her or it however you want to.
It was more like getting saved on your works.
And so there, it's very easy he didn't develop it here, but that little bit he showed at the beginning, the apron,
Yeah.
they actively teach this as a sign, as a symbol of the integrity and the rectitude with which one needs to live in order to enter the Great Lodge. Which you see presents the idea that being the good man would get you to the good lodge. Now, the question is, how could a Christian, good Protestant Christian, be a Mason then?
I don't know, but they do it every day.
Yeah, so how can he do that? Well, can't you? No, they do it openly. They're not concerned about hiding their masonry.
Is that for business or?
But how could he resolve this tension between salvation by grace and and these open statements about the need for your righteousness? They don't use that word. They talk about integrity and rectitude and goodness and charity, which are all works issues. How in the world can you resolve that if you're a Christian? It's easy. You never had to deal with Matthew 25?
I think I heard that. I think that.
Matthew 25?
4, is it 4? Matthew 25, 4?
It's a little bit further down in the chapter than that.
I think they were talking about that on KSBJ.
You weren't listening.
No, I heard it.
When the master comes, he's going to divide the people on the right hand and the left hand. He's going to say to those on the left hand,
I don't know.
I was hungry and you didn't feed me. I was thirsty and you didn't give me to drink. I was naked and you didn't clothe me. I was in prison and sick and you didn't visit me. And then he's going to say to those on the right, come enjoy all the wonders of my kingdom, because I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. How do you resolve Matthew 25 and salvation by grace? The same way you resolve Galatians and James. The same way you resolve Romans or Ephesians and the book of Hebrews. It's very clear in the Christian faith that we are saved, we are reconciled to God, we are given his Spirit, not on the basis of what we do or say or think, but on the basis of what Jesus did. But if to any degree at all you believe in that truth of what Jesus did, and you accept it as the saving factor of your life,
then you're saved.
then you are going to show your faith by your works. In your love for the Lord, you are going to obey him. You are going to have the fruit of the Spirit flourish in your life. You will be a person of significant integrity and rectitude and charity. And so, as a Christian, as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, his moral standards become necessity. They become demand. They become requirements. It would be unthinkable as a believer in Jesus, as a follower of the Savior, for me to behave in immoral and unholy and destructive and antisocial behavior. And so all I have to do is recognize that my Masonic commitments are on my having been saved side of living. That in a very real way, it is necessary for me to really follow Jesus if I expect to get into heaven. Just on a practical term, you see, when Jesus was resurrected, he went to heaven, didn't he?
Yes.
Okay. When he resurrects me, how am I going to get to heaven if I don't follow him there?
That's right.
Okay, so if I don't follow him, where am I going to end up? Where it was I was going, you know. But it wasn't with him, it wasn't after him. If I'm not walking in his footsteps, I'm not going to end up where he is. And it won't make any difference how hard he tried to get me there. If I won't follow him, I'm not going to end up there. Now that's a pretty crude illustration, but it puts out the point that there is a very clear way in which I'll be eligible to get there, not because of what I did, but because of what he did. But I'm not going to get there if I don't do what he did.
So how does that principle play out with the other principle as to where you're supposed to congregate and pray for each other
it plays out because unless I do that, I'm probably going to have a hard time following him. I'm going to have a hard time doing this on my own.
So how is that, how is the first principle justified thinking, you know, I don't need to go to church, I can just be a free man?
You can't, not in the biblical sense. That's why gathering in community, living out in community is so essential to the Christian faith in the New Testament. Because that's the only way you can do it. The individualistic view of, I don't need the church, I don't need the community. I've got Jesus and me, we got our thing going. Ignores the character of how God operates, even in terms of the Spirit. The fundamental teaching of the Spirit in the New Testament is God gives the Spirit to one person in order to help somebody else.
Right. So you can't just put him in a box and
The
say,
Spirit is not given to me essentially for me. The measure of the Holy Spirit, the filling of the Holy Spirit is for me to help others. Look at that interesting little verse in Ephesians, where at the end of this long list of ethical behaviors, Paul closes the whole discussion by saying, and you really shouldn't be drunk with wine, you ought to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And what happens if you're full of the Holy Spirit? You'll talk to one another in songs and hymns and spiritual songs. The action of the Spirit is not that, you know, whatever thing you want to imagine, and particularly in the modern day, we emphasize in the charismatic movement, that's not be filled with the Spirit. Being filled with the Spirit connects me with my brothers and sisters. Same thing in 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul explicitly talks about the gifts of the Spirit. And he says different things are given to different people, and he uses three things, and he attributes one to the Father, one to the Son, and one to the Holy Spirit. And he says each one is given his thing for each other. You don't get the gifts so you can do something. You get the gifts so you can do something for somebody else.
Yep.
Now, it's a very essential quality in which living by, walking by the Spirit, the emphasis in particular in Romans 6, 7, and 8, is very clearly an internal moral factor. But when you get to the empowers of the Spirit, which Paul does in 12, it's the same thing. They're all, the gifts of the Spirit are all for others.
So we can walk in his love and share his love.
Yes.
With others.
Yes. And they can share it with us.
And it's not something you can hide, it's something you can keep in.
No, no.
You have it, you want to get it.
Yeah. And so, even when Masonry is so focused as they would be in a secular society, in a society not clearly committed to Christianity, where the only thing there is to be the best person you can be. And you really need to be the best person you can be, because one of these days you're going to die, and there is a creator, and you're going to have to answer to him. Now, I'm not sure exactly how that works and what all the rules are. You know, I can make all that fuzzy and sentimental and all that kind of stuff. And I don't have to deal with it in a Christian way. The Christian can come to this insistence upon good living and morality and holiness and righteousness and charity and all of this. He can come to this and see this as important, as necessary, and as an element of your standing with God without not a whole lot of difficulty, because at church he's already celebrating the grace that he has in Jesus. Now, to us purists, he really shouldn't be doing that. But all of us aren't purists. Masonry became, in the last 10 years, became a really big thing among the Southern Baptists. There were a number of their guys who, ex-Masons and others, who became, well, who followed the trend that some others have, that this is a cult. And there's no way that a Christian can support it. And yet there were all these Baptist churches full of Masons. And they had no small argument over it. And they only resolved it among themselves by agreeing to the fact that this is really a matter of personal opinion, and therefore we churches can't really make an issue about it, and so we just have to let everybody make his own decision. And so, you could see how a lot of very active church leaders, I mean, really active in their church, sacrificially in their giving and so forth, could, because of family tradition, their community interest, their need to get together to know some of these Masons, so they've got some business connections, whatever their motives may be, could aggressively, even actively support their involvement in a Masonic lodge. Because whenever they're saying all the kind of stuff they have to say in their meetings or whatever it is, they can say it with their fingers crossed, they can say it, that's a bunch of malarkey, that's a bunch of mythology, that's a bunch of fake news, whatever, and, just pass it by. And not wrestle with, yeah, but that really doesn't sound right to my Christian faith. And I suppose there's probably even a few guys around in some of these churches who are active in the Masonic Lodge so they can win people to Jesus.
Inside the Masonic Lodge?
Yeah, inside the fellowship of they can't do it inside the lodge, but inside that community. And the only way they can get close to these guys, because they're really big on the lodge, they're going to join the lodge so they can get close to these guys. And they feel like there's nothing pointedly religious about the Masonic Lodge. And therefore, this falderall that they have to put up with is something they can put up with, like they did the pledge they made with the fraternity when they were in college, or, club they belonged to as a kid. And they see no real challenge because they're not being challenged by it. Now, do you know anything like that in the Bible?
Like that, a group, the Pharisees?
Like you challenging and people being challenged in their faith and others not. That's the discussion in Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 10. Meat in the market in the ancient world was often meat left over from the sacrificing of animals in the temple. Now that was, the animal was slaughtered in a religious ceremony. Is it permissible for a Christian to eat that meat? Or one step further, this meat was slaughtered in the temple as a part of the celebration of a person's birthday, or the birth of their baby, or the marriage of their son or their daughter. And they brought the meat home to the reception, and they're serving it in their home. And you've been invited as a friend, as a neighbor, to come to this reception where the meat is going to be idol worship meat. Can you do that? Is that permissible? Could you go to the temple grounds and participate in his reception as his friend? Would it be permissible for you to do that so you could demonstrate your love and care for him, your respect for him, so you could witness to him? And Paul's point in all of those passages is, some of you can, but some of you can't.
Paul said that?
Yeah. In the instance of eating the meat, he says, go ahead, don't ask any questions. They serve the meat, you eat it. But if somebody says to you, did you know that meat was from the temple? Then for their conscience sake, don't. Now, I think the implication is the person told you that because they were concerned about eating it. They saw you eating it, and so they're not sure what to do. And so they inform you, they raise the issue of where that meat came from, so they're clearly bothered by it. If they're bothered by it, you don't have to eat it. You respect their conscience and deprive yourself. But if they didn't raise the question, but nothing wrong with it. The God that was offered to doesn't exist, does he? So the fact that it was a sacrifice was a figment of the person's imagination. It wasn't a real God. Now, in another place, he's willing to recognize they might be demons. And so he opens the door for a personal responsibility that has always been troubling to the church. It's almost impossible for us to live with this. So we don't usually, we make rules. And then we make you follow my rules. Or I accept your rules and I follow your rules. And not the lordship of Jesus, which is the real issue. And that, of course, could be an issue in Masonry. Is your pledge to Masonry, to the Masonic Lodge, to the fraternal community, is your commitment to them an erosion of your commitment to Jesus? Are they a higher authority? Would that commitment at some time lead you to compromise your commitment to the lordship of Jesus? And that, of course, would depend on a whole number of circumstances. And of course, those questions are true of anything that you belong to, associate with. There are no small number of social workers, Christians who are professional social workers, psychologists who are professional psychologists, degree doctors of psychology who are having trouble with associations who have now moved to views of morality on particular issues that don't happen to match very well historic Christian views of morality. Can I keep my association credentials? Can I keep my, well, does my commitment, does my pledge of allegiance to the Constitution of Texas require me to give this marriage license to a same-sex couple, even if I believe it's wrong? Who is really Lord of my life? And how do I respect that lordship and obey it?
It's getting more and more difficult because of the conduct of the
Of course,
So you might as well.
yeah.
But
You're,
it stands up for the rights of God the Christ.
you're gonna be put in the position of, but you see, you have that problem in all kinds of situations. At what level do you emphasize grace over law? How loving can you be to the sinner when he does not even see his behavior as sin?
Don't help those that don't help themselves.
And, you know, that's easy to say when it's just somebody in the community, but what do you do when it's family? When it's your parent, your brother, your sister, your child?
Now, I guess you try to accept them and love them, but you can't change them. Because our society's geared to it that way. Even in colleges now, they say you can't say she or he to your students. I guess you say it. But anyway.
So it depends on which group. There's a whole new vocabulary for that, and it depends on which group you're in as to which the vocabulary they're choosing.
So you can list the job.
Yeah.
It's really a God just
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about the Masons that I can't answer?
No, the only thing that I found on this was, and this was about Freemasons, was connected to Rosharon. Are they connected?
No, they're not officially connected.
They're not.
Rosicrucians were another much, much smaller, never made a big deal. Basically secret fraternal order, more religiously oriented or spiritually oriented. I'm not sure to what degree they develop a full-scale religious practice and that kind of thing. And I'm not, they didn't develop near as elaborately as the Masons in terms of orders and stations and status and all this kind of stuff. And they're more open to, they were more spiritually oriented and more open to the broader range of spirituality, like the Theosophy people were, the spirits, not as much for the dead as the Spiritists were. They were more broadly focused on revelation of the spirit world by the masters, which mediums would be open to, not ordinary people would be open to. So they're much more spiritually oriented than the Masons ever were concerned about being. And I think mainly because the vast number of the Masons from early days were at least nominal Christians. And so Masonry never took the direction of becoming particularly religiously oriented. Their ceremonies will take on the quality of religious significance. The one by which you become a master Mason has frequently been compared, because of some terminology they use, to the Christian experience of baptism, born again, that kind of thing. In fact, you may not have caught it, but in this ceremony, the guy talked about his rebirth.
These other ones, they believe in rebirth. publishing and all that.
And they were much more, there's a far greater range of medieval superstition and mythology involved in them. And they don't become anything more than a very, very small group of people. They still exist. I think they even have a website now. But they're of, not anywhere near the social impact that the Masons have.
I was thinking that, and it looks like the leader, he had, we talked before about having teachers come to him, which were like spirit guides.
Yeah.
So it almost sounded like, to me, I said, well, I wonder why they didn't take off like the Mormons, because I know that the Mormons, when Joseph Smith had his come to him. But this guy, he has a bunch of, like they call it brothers or something.
Yeah.
And actually told him to write this book.
Yeah, you get and you have those same kind of things in theosophy, where you have connection to the spirit world by these masters that reveal to certain mediums. And then you get into the whole thing about how the medium gets it. Some medium got it, heard it, saw it in a dream. Some of them simply started writing one day, and they were like a stenographer, except they weren't hearing anything. Their hand was just writing, and they were writing down whatever it was the master was putting on their fingers. And you get the broad-based morality that you get in Hinduism. A lot of Eastern mysticism involved in it. So it's a very eclectic thing, but it's much more spirit oriented than the Masons ever become.
There's something running in the background.
Okay, I need to check it then.
Yeah.